I'm delighted to welcome Karl Treacher. Karl's background is in science, marketing, culture and leadership, as well as his research into brand reputation and culture has led over to over 60 published articles, as well as speaking engagements at TEDx and the Committee for Economic Development in Australia. There's not much Karl hasn't done, from working with Arnold Schwarzenegger to competing in a variety of endurance sports. Perhaps what I'm most jealous of as a huge cricket fan is his work with the Australia cricket team. Welcome, Karl. Oh, and I should probably say he's a very good friend of mine. So welcome, Karl Treacher. Hello.
Hey, Matt. We were very good friends until you talked about the rain in Sydney.
Can't help the truth. It was diabolical. I used to love October in Sydney, but I won't be coming back there again for a while. So, but yeah, November's the month. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you and your wise words. And thank you very much for hosting this Australasian leg of the Inspirathon.
Thanks, Matt. No problem.
Yeah.
So I'll be hosting for the next couple of hours. I'll do a little talk for 15 or 20 minutes very shortly. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Gomarigal people I'm coming from, which is the northern beaches of Sydney. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As Matt mentioned, my job's to study people, has been to study people and groups of people for a long time, whether that's ethnography or a lifelong student of science and social science. I'm fascinated by individuals, by what happens when individuals come together, what happens when people decide to follow someone as a leader, what that turns out to produce, and what the impact that has on people personally. So the idea at the Culture Institute of Australia, obviously I'm the CEO there, we spend all of our time investigating the impacts that people have on people, and I'll be talking about that today. I'll be throwing to a couple of other speakers when I'm finished. Some terrific speakers lined up, and this Inspirathon is something that I've been part of a couple of times, and it's a really great way for all of us to start exploring and listening to one another and learning about what's happening in different pockets, what's happening in different organizations, how are people managing the pandemic, all the things that we hear about, from the great resignation and quiet quitting more recently through to work styles and the like. What are the solutions? What can we do? And I think if we do spend some time sharing and listening, we'll all be better off for that. So I'm going to talk a little bit around a few topics. Everything that I say here is based in our research at the Culture Institute and some meta-analysis that we've done around other reputable research. So with an Inspirathon, it's very tempting to hit the hype button. It is really important that we are upbeat and positive. Matt mentioned a variety of influences at the moment, some being political, others being environmental, and the more we can do together to work together to face into those, the better. But I'm not necessarily going to hit the hype button first. My job, I see, is to identify the barriers to inspiring workplaces, because then we can actually give ourselves a chance by identifying those barriers and the culture contaminants that create unhealthy practices. And so if we identify those, at least we can do something about it. So the majority of my time with you today is talking about toxic leadership. And look, I'm guilty of this as well. I think we all are, that we generalize and we assume that we understand what toxic leadership is. And it can range from anything that's a personality discrepancy through to gross misconduct. And so I wanted to provide a little bit of structure around what toxic leadership is and how it comes about, and also its prevalence in the workplace. So I did want to start by debunking one of the biggest myths in organizations and in organizational performance at the moment, and that is that every person can become a leader. Every person is a leader. And I don't want to start on a negative note necessarily, but that's complete nonsense. If you think about your school life, your university life, or any sort of workplace or group that you've been part of, there are people within that are the right leader for that particular group in that particular time. There are also people in that group that should have no business being a leader. But because of the constructs and the processes that organizations stand up, you can actually sequentially move yourself into a leadership role, sometimes regardless of your capability to do that job. that is at the heart of enormous cultural engagement problems at the moment for us, as we're all sort of floundering and trying to find a way to bring about positive culture. So I'll end up talking today in general terms around what I think and what the Culture Institute recommends for organizations in 2023 in terms of thriving. But let me start with a quick story. So my daughter is in a musical theatre. She's 9. She can really sing. So on the weekend, I took a singing quiz, which was essentially me singing into the computer for 4 minutes to see essentially what my tone was, and my range, and if I was any good. And look, it was no surprise that I came out at a 5 out of 10 on the baritone, and my range is between A and F, whatever that means. So to me, that sounds about right. I've never considered myself a singer. I only did the test because my daughter was doing it, and she scored a 9 out of 10, and she gave me a hug at the end to make sure I was okay with my score, which I was. But that score represented a lot of reinforcement that I'd had through my life, that I can hold a tune maybe, but I'm not putting my hand up if I'm at a concert and someone says, who wants to be the lead singer, or who's the lead singer? So I'm very comfortable with that. But let's just imagine that I received feedback or received feedback through my life that I actually was a great singer, that, my dog's snoring a second. Hey, wake up. Okay, so I'd received feedback that my dog was literally snoring and still is. I'd received feedback that I was a great singer. And so I thought myself as a 9 out of 10. I've been recruited into musical theatre, perhaps. I was the lead singer of a band. And then people started coming to our gigs. And then the feedback card that they gave at our gigs after I was the lead singer and the band performed was, we got a 1.7 out of 10. People in the audience were clearly not into us, not happy. At 1.7, they were looking for the escape doors to go to another auditorium. They were disgruntled. They're probably talking to other people about how bad it is. So as a lead singer in that particular group, I need to take some responsibility that I probably wasn't as good as I thought I was. In fact, I might have been terrible. A 70% in any sort of test means things are poor. Now let's flip this a little bit and look through a similar but different lens in the workplace. Leaders are the lead singers of culture and engagement. So if we look at Gallup's insights that suggest that the average engagement score across New Zealand and Australia is 17%, that's our 1.7 out of 10. So in my mind, this is disastrous and we are not doing what we should be doing. Now you're probably thinking, or people that you work with or companies that you've consulted to or companies that you're in might say, that's not us. We're 55 or 56 or 60. We might be 70 even if we're doing particularly well. That's not particularly good. That's not a great score. So unlike my singing, no one relies on my singing. Even if I was the lead singer of a band, you'd be disappointed. You might want your money back. Leaders have a direct influence on shareholder return, employee engagement, employee experience, well-being, and a range of other things. So people are dramatically and directly reliant on a leader's ability to lead. So let's move away from my little singing story and go into some actual bona fide statistics. So recent study found that 48%, the toxic leadership has led to a 48% decrease in work effort and 38% decrease in work quality. Another survey by Life Meets Work found that there is a turnover rate of up to 73% due to toxic leadership. So earlier I said, we're going to talk about toxic leadership. What is it? Well, the word toxic comes from Greek mythology around to poison. And if you think about, and we all know case studies and stories here, someone inside an organization or in a group who is toxic or is poison to that group or that organization. And we've spent years consulting to enormous organizations of 30,000 plus. And some of those organizations have tens of thousands of toxic people within them because that toxin spreads and the group becomes poisoned as a result. And it's only when those people leave that they don't reflect and say, I'm a toxic person. They're not a toxic person. They've just been in a toxic culture, engaged in toxic practices because of a toxic leader. So it's important that we recognize toxic leaders have an enormous, dramatic, disastrous impact on organizations. So leadership itself is about two things, character and substance. So if you look back over the last 50 years, leaders, those people in authority, there's a lot of instances where their toxic leadership has led to reputation scandal. And as we know, every reputation scandal starts in culture. Currently in Australia, we have New South Wales government sexual harassment issues in culture. That's a massive reputation scandal for them. You only need to look at AFL football. There's a variety of things going on there, that there's been inadequacies in terms of culture that have led to reputation. So from a shareholder and organisation performance perspective, it's huge. From a personal well-being perspective, it's huge as well. And toxic leadership has been present in organisations through society forever. So a couple of researchers, Brooks and Fitzen from Bond University in Australia and Simon Kroom from the University of San Diego, found that 1 in 5 bosses in the upper echelons of large organizations have sociopathic tendencies. They generalized and said they're sociopaths. I don't know if that's necessarily fair. I think we could say they had a disassociation with their feelings, which limited their ability to have empathy and be an engaging leader. And I'll talk more about engaging leadership in a minute. We are moving from an era of charisma and charismatic leaders into empathetic leaders. Authentic leadership is now talked about. Engaging leadership or engagement-based leadership, also important. And as we face into 2023 and what organizations are going to need to heal the wounds of the pandemic, it's empathy, it's engagement, it's understanding and generosity. So there's a particular style of leader that's going to be more effective moving into 2023. When you are looking at identification of toxic leaders, so there's a couple of myths I'll talk about in a minute. One of them is that we can identify toxic leaders. Not necessarily the case with observational research. At the Culture Institute, we've spent a lot of time and years now developing tools to identify the behaviors and the self-impression and self-perception that indicates a toxic leader. So we can provide a flag to our clients. We can put a screen up to say, there's a concern here, this is a person of interest, as opposed to typical metrics in recruitment or review, which might be capability and experience in education. So Dr. Marsha Lynn Whitaker, or Whisker, I think is probably how she pronounced that, was the first to look at toxic leadership. And she had a scale, and it comes from anything from being incompetent all the way through to evil. But the scale here was, is the leader trustworthy? And it's a green light. Are they transitioning? So are they trustworthy in times and untrustworthy or toxic in others, or are they actually just toxic? And so when we ran a massive network analysis study with one of the largest banks in Australia, we correlated their identified talent and their leaders against those that had the greatest connections based on emotional reliability and trust. And there was very little correlation between the two, which means leaders had been put in positions of power without actually understanding their ability and their network in terms of building that collaborative way of working. And in every instance, when you look at a toxic leader, ambition outweighs ethics. There's a CEO that we've worked with in several companies who has a great saying and talks about over-ambitious ordinary men. And unfortunately, that's largely the case when we come to toxic leaders. You know, if you had to do a gender preference, it is men. You have to look at the way that they see the world. There's very individualistic behavior, and they are very ambitious and overly competitive and authoritative. So individualistic desires trumps care and responsibility for the greater good. And moving into 2023 with different work styles, work from home, hybrid working, trust is critical. And this over-reliance on power, as opposed to an understanding and fostering and nurturing trust, is the calling card of the toxic leader. If I was to say, let's look at 3 different types of toxic leaders, and there's a lot, by the way, and you can call them a variety of things. The one that we all know and we all see very obviously is a narcissistic leader. Now, let's not throw the stones too quickly, because at the moment there's a massive trend societally around narcissism. Social media is largely to blame, but people are caring more about themselves and they're becoming more self-absorbed than they have been in the past. That's a trend. So it would make sense that trend then infiltrates the ranks of leadership. So grandiose sense of self-importance and arrogance, preoccupation with themselves and their ambition, their brilliance, fantasies about them saving the world type of thing, a belief that they're special and they require excessive admiration and entitlement. We know these people. You see these people. Now, they can be very charming and they're also very captivating. So a lot of narcissistic leaders, you would say they're very impressive, but that's because they're doing one role. They're there to impress you around a concept that they might be talking about. In terms of leadership, how well do they go in actually stopping, listening, recognizing who you are, recognizing you, giving you a sense that they see a future for you and they'll work with you on that future? That's a narcissistic leader. Doesn't have those traits. The controlling leader is the second one. Now, the controlling leader is just miserable. So they're very serious and formal. Everything is, look, our diagnostic changed in the last couple of years too to include serious, because that is representative of a controlling leader, a type of toxic leader. Very grim, very tense, joyless, rigid. They don't have that spontaneity, curiosity. It's a very controlled environment and it stifles people's livelihood and their lives. The last is the neurotic imposter. And I love this one because they're just essentially a bundle of anxiety that has, for some reason, been put into a leadership role. And so they set very high goals that they're probably unlikely to meet and that other people are unlikely to meet, but they'll be equally critical when you don't. So there's a victim mentality that's associated with the neurotic imposter. So they're not really that interested in people and growth of people. They're very, very interested on delivering or meeting the test that they've set themselves with every particular task. So before we get too down and think that the world's miserable and we're supposed to be doing the inspiring workplace here, the reality is not everyone is a toxic leader. And in fact, the majority aren't. So a recent study found that if you had to categorize and classify leaders, up to 50% are transformational leaders. And we all know transformational leadership has been given some really good raps. It's important with the innovation era that we're in and the focus on growth. Transformational leaders and entrepreneurial leaders are very important, with only 8 to 10% being toxic. But what about the other 40 to 60%? And that's where I'm going to focus my time, because yes, we are going through a position of change and a period of dramatic change post-pandemic, but we need to heal the scars of what's happened here. There's enormous ambiguity and misunderstanding and confusion around work styles. What's our agreed way of working? How am I going to make this work? Are you going to make me come back to the office? For the next 2 years at least, the engaging leader is going to be the preferential leadership style, particularly around strategy. Because I'm going to talk in a minute about some statistics around productivity. But when it comes to culture and bringing people back together, those leaders now need to be expert in bringing people back together to effectively collaborate around strategy. If you can't do that, if you don't have those interpersonal soft skills to do that and be that leader, it's going to be very difficult to do it, and you're going to perpetuate the existing anxiety. Some myths about toxic leaders just quickly. So one I mentioned before, that they're easy to identify. They're actually not easy to identify. A lot of the subsections and subtypes of toxic leaders, they blend in because they're expert at blending in, because they like to manipulate based on their ambition. And so some can be very charming. The other myth is that their behavior leads to dissent. People don't want to work with them. In some cases that's true. But in other cases, that's not true, and they will attract other people like them. And so you can have toxic units and toxic subculture. And so that's another area of insight that we have to get really clear on, that we can't grow these incubators of toxicity. The other thing that I get disappointed by is that organizations will say, look, I'm not right now, capability trumps culture. And that's complete rubbish. Culture will always trump capability in the longer term and often in the short term. It's just that there's a war on talent. We don't have the right people. Let's just get someone in who can do the job. They've got some runs on the board. However, within 12, 6 months, 18 months, whatever it might be, the place is a shambles, or they've set things in flight that are going to be very detrimental to the organization. You might have lost key talent through that because they won't work with them. The last myth is that they're easy to remove. That is absolutely not the case. They often have very deep roots. Removing anyone, as we know, particularly a leader, can be very difficult. And so our recommendation here is that, history has told us that there are toxic leaders at the top of a lot of organizations, Enron, Lehman Brothers, WorldCom, and that's just a couple. There's actually thousands of others in flight. Our recommendation is that you do the work early to identify them, that you run a screening process, and you also run a review that looks back at the leader to be able to identify their behaviors and see what's actually happening here. So if we talk about toxic leaders, and hopefully we're not all too down about that, what about culture? So toxic leaders and culture. So leadership's defined as a particular individual's ability to purposefully influence others. Okay. Engagement is the positive association with a person-centered leadership style. Okay, that's that relationship. Engaging leadership, at this point, I've mentioned this before, it's empathy, it's engagement, it's listening, generosity, and curiosity in people. And it's the most important trait for us at the moment. So the future of organizations for 2023 and beyond really relies on the growth of psychological capital that comes from particular leadership styles. Now, when I say psychological capital, and I know most of us understand what that means, but it's an employee's motivational propensity to work towards a goal and be resilient in that goal. So if we're looking to foster that, which essentially is productivity and effectiveness, we have to have the right type of leader doing that. And psychological capital, it's a malleable element, so it's open to development. It can be enhanced through positive leadership, high engagement leadership, and it's diminished by negative incompetence and toxic leadership. So we talked about toxic leaders before. It's easy to put a brush across them and say, gee, they're bad people. It's not really about whether they're good or bad people. It comes back to, are we fostering a great experience for individuals and teams so that they can, one, enjoy themselves, their lives, but two, be productive and high performance for the organization. And that comes down to, are we fostering psychological capital effectively? So if we have a toxic leader, they're not going to be able to design meaningful and motivational work for them. High engagement leaders will. Toxic leaders won't support and coach their employees. High engagement leaders will. Toxic leaders won't facilitate rewarding culture and the way that they facilitate interactions. High engagement leaders will. Toxic leaders won't enhance personal resources. They'll actually drain that, whereas engagement or authentic leaders and engagement-based leaders, it's their primary way of operating. All right, I feel like I've gone into a lot of detail there on that, so I'm just going to wrap that up. I think we all need to rethink the idea and challenge anyone that tells you that anyone can be a leader. That myth itself has ruined companies, and it's ruining the lives of individuals right now all over the country and beyond. So at the Culture Institute, our mission is to transform leadership and transform culture. That starts by doing much better in the identification of engaging leaders, not toxic leaders, both before they come in, so recruitment, excuse me, and in the workplace themselves. We have 3 recommendations. Every workplace should be screening leaders for cultural leadership. I know about 4 companies that we're working with. It's at the moment, I don't want to say it, but it seems a little bit lazy to be reliant on the things that you've been using before to screen. Cultural leadership is the most important element inside the organization. You have to screen for it. Every workplace should be reviewing their leaders' cultural practices. So I had a client recently say to me, look, we don't like getting feedback on our leaders. We don't like to survey employees to give feedback on their team leaders. It's madness. That's one of the only ways you're going to be able to identify how effective that leader is. And if they are a high engagement leader, if they're a transformational leader, entrepreneurial leader, what type of leader are they? And does that type of leader actually speak to the strategy that's in place at the moment and foster behaviors and work practices that support that? So finally, leaders that have very low empathy. Now, this is a big one, and that a variety of tools will do that. Our tools will do it. Other tools will do this. as opposed to traditional metrics where you say, oh, we're all different. Here's our DISC profile or Myers-Briggs, and we're all different. If you have a people leader with low empathy right now, they've got no place being there. They've got no business being in that role. Doesn't mean they won't be great entrepreneurial leaders. It just means that you shouldn't put a team under them. Same with anxious leaders that instill fear and drive individualistic behavior. Don't put people under. They're not people leaders, particularly in the next few years. So we've talked about toxic leadership. We've talked about health and cultural health. That you could assume wrongly that that's the whole conversation around culture. And the reality is a lot of companies do see it like that. But that's really what engagement's about. Engagement will tell you how engaged people are with a particular leader. It's a very valuable statistic. But at the Culture Institute, talking about culture, we need to rise above what's healthy and unhealthy. That's a foundation, and it needs to be there. However, culture is strategy. Culture talks about the type of organization or the type of culture and how well does that align to the strategy. So for too long, we've talked about culture being healthy and unhealthy. And that, look, it's important. It's just the beginning. But the real value is the ability to unite people around purpose and strategy and shape the way that people work together. So relying on engagement data alone, it's not doing the job. It doesn't tell you the style or the type of leader and how appropriate they are for the type of strategy. For instance, tech firm need a high growth. We need to have high growth in the organization. You need a particular style of leader for that. You're not going to get that from an engagement study. You're not going to get that from traditional metrics in terms of employment either. So there are billions of dollars being left on the table at the moment because of limited insights coming from engagement data alone. Yes, engagement and cultural health are important, but culture type and leadership style deliver exponential growth. And if you're not measuring it, you're not going to be aware of it. Okay, lastly, my final recommendation in terms of the Culture Institute's position on work from home, and this is going to be a topic that is going to be discussed over the next 20 hours, probably more than anything else. How are we going to do this? You don't need to look too deeply into any sort of institute or any sort of research to identify that productivity is up from work from home. Enormous studies from Stanford University through to Airtasker have recognized that there's a big productivity lift in those people working from home. Let's look at a couple of them. Okay. Stanford University, 16,000 workers, 9 months, increased productivity by 13 to 20%. Increased performance was due to more time, fewer breaks, fewer sick days. 77% of those who work remotely at least a few times a month, they show increased productivity. So 30% of those do more work in less time and 24% do more work at the same period, according to Connect Solutions. These studies are endless, that there is a massive uptick in terms of getting productivity out of people, as you'd expect, because they're saving 8.5 hours a week or 408 hours a year in transport. Generally, that's the average. So you pretty much hope that there's going to be an uplift in productivity. So Gartner believes by the end of 2023, 40% of companies will use Operations Anywhere to combine virtual physical interactions and customers and employees. Great. Sounds like I'm saying everyone should work from home, but I'm not. At the Culture Institute and other areas of insight, it's been very clear that whilst productivity is up, there is a cost to culture, and the cost is huge. Study from Airtasker that I mentioned before, 70% of people value the social relationship as important as the work that gets done. Now, we've had to come to a position in terms of our Australian workplace culture standards or guidelines that we've released, in the advice that I give our clients in terms of having a formal recommendation. We've come to a position only very recently that for teams that aren't over 80% focused on data processing, that there should be a 3-day-a-week in-office agreement. No more, no less. And those days are Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Now, we are on the verge of societal change to this rhythm, and the faster we all get on board with that, the more infrastructure will support it. And by having a 3-day-a-week work week, you have all the benefits of more time in the other marriages that people have, married to their work, married to their family, and married to themselves. So health and well-being, great. Better relationships, great. And also this whole idea of, thank God it's Friday, I can't wait for the weekend, it's eradicated. So that balance is our formal recommendation moving forward. So in summary,
okay. Hi, Karl. I'm just if you're wrapping up now, that'd be fantastic, because obviously we've got a tight agenda ahead of us today. So I think you're wrapping up right now. So if you can, we have our next speaker waiting in the wings.
15 seconds. 4 recommendations summary. Screen toxic leaders before they're appointed using new generation tools. Identify toxic leaders within your organization. Set the type of culture your business needs, not just engagement and healthy culture. And move to a 3-day-a-week in-office agreement for all teams who aren't predominantly in data processing. Matt, that is my talk complete.